Hello, everybody. My name is Gisela, and I'm an associate professor in political science at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign. I'm also the director of the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies at this university. Welcome to our first talk of the semester, and also on the third one in the year that we organized together with the Latin American and Caribbean Studies Center from the University of Maryland. This collaboration focuses mostly on analyzing different political situations in Latin America and the Caribbean. And today we are going to talk about yesterday's election in El Salvador, the results, the implications. So as you can see, we have an amazing panel that we will moderate with Isabella Alcañiz, who is professor of Ciencia Política and director of the Latin American and Caribbean Centers, both at the University of Maryland. So before Isabella introduces the panelists, I just wanted to emphasize that you can add your questions along the way in the Q&A, and we will read them. So thank you so much for being here to listen to these amazing groups of scholars analyzing the elections in El Salvador.
Thank you, Gisela. I just want to say before I read your bios that we have had this wonderful series of Charlas Políticas following the electoral calendar in Latin America and the Caribbean for now over 2 years. And I think few events that have all been well attended have had so many people join in so quickly. So, not surprisingly, there is so much interest in what's going on in El Salvador. So without further ado, let me introduce our two wonderful panelists. First, María Méndez Gutiérrez, who is an assistant professor at the Department of Political Science of the University of Toronto. Dr. Méndez researches violence in and against the Global South and the illicit global economy. Her book project examines the gendered political economy of transnational gang violence in Central America. As part of an SSHRC-funded international team, Maria is working to document and commemorate the history of the Salvadoran Civil War. Recent publications include Acuerpar, the Decolonial Feminist Call for Embodied Solidarity, which came out last year in Science, and Studying Gangs in Central and South America, Reflections on Gender and Researcher Positionality, which also came out last year in the Oxford Handbook of Gangs and Society. Maybe it didn't come out yet, but it's about to come out. I know the larger ones sometimes take a while, but you should check it out as soon as it comes out. So Maria, thank you so much for being with us and welcome. And then it's my pleasure to introduce also Manuel Meléndez-Sánchez, who is a PhD candidate in political science at Harvard University, where he's affiliated with the David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies. In 2023, he was a Minerva Peace and Security Scholar at the United States Institute of Peace. Manuel studies contemporary challenges to democracy with a focus on Latin America. His dissertation examines what he calls criminal electioneering, the deliberate attempts by criminal organizations to influence elections in Mexico and Central America. Manuel's writing has appeared in the Journal of Democracy, Lawfare, Slate, The Washington Post, and others. Manuel has an AB from Harvard College and a master's in science from Oxford, where he was a Weidenfeld Hoffman Scholar and a member of St. Anthony's College. He was born and raised in San Salvador, El Salvador. So bienvenido, Manuel. Welcome, Manuel. It's a pleasure to have you both. And as I had mentioned before, we have two very general questions so that you have some leeway in your answers. The first one I will pose, and that is, what are two immediate conclusions you draw from yesterday's or maybe this morning's results? And just a reminder, if you can try to keep your answers to about 8 minutes, I suspect that we will have many questions and comments from the audience, and so that'll give us enough time to address those at the end of the 2 rounds of questions. Maybe we can go in the order that I introduce you. Maria first. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sin and Dr. Alcañiz, for this invitation. Yeah, so what are two immediate conclusions that I draw from the results, ongoing results, right? First thing, right, this is not surprising. The results are not surprising. They're not surprising anyone. What we're witnessing really is, I think, the complete transformation of El Salvador from a multi-party system to a one-party rule. To the one-party rule of Nuevas Ideas, which is the party of Bukele, and which he founded only in 2017, right? So this is, actually something quite incredible, and we see that these results are cementing then this one-party state, and this will make it even more difficult for the political opposition to regain influence. So that's, the first conclusion that I draw, and elections in El Salvador used to be contentious, right? So you've had since the 1990s, you've had two dominant parties, and this is the FMLN and Arena, right? So the FMLN is the leftist party, the Farabundo Liberation Party, Farabundo Martí National Liberation Party, and then Arena, right, which is the National Republican Alliance, the Conservative Party. So you've had this, this multi-party system, but really dominated by these two parties. And elections used to be contentious. So just prior to the election, you were really waiting to see what the results were gonna show you. Partly because it wasn't set in stone. And this time, I think that, political analysts and just, I think people in El Salvador too, right, didn't feel that contention. There was even a survey, I think, from Francisco Gavida University, and then, some of the respondents were asked if they knew who the other competitors were, who the other candidates were. A lot of people didn't know who they were, right? So that's just to give you an idea that, people didn't know who was running for FMLN, for Arena. And, so most of us knew that this would, that Bukele would just take a landslide victory. And this was from the moment that his Congress purged the Constitutional Court in 2021, right? And then enabled his reelection. So I think since then, we've known that that this is a government, right, that has chipped away this system of checks and balances slowly, and now it's clear that maybe this is a strong statement, but that there's virtually no opposition. That's one conclusion I'm drawing. The second one is that the state of exception that was instituted by the Bukele government will continue, right? That we will continue to see the buildup of a security state in El Salvador, and we will see military and police powers expanding. That's something that will happen. And despite all kinds of irregularities that happened with the election system, I think the electricity went off, and then some, votes are being counted manually, and then, people in the diaspora have some stories, maybe in the Q&A I can share some about, just the irregularities of voting in other countries. But just despite all of that, right, just Salvadorans have largely voted in favor of security, in favor of the buildup of the security state, and for many reasons, right? Primarily, the fact that you've had gangs in El Salvador that have caused tremendous damage in the country, right? And so part of the popularity of Bukele, comes from this fight against the gangs, and from the state of emergency that was implemented since 2022, right, to combat the gangs. And so in El Salvador, you will continue to be arrested without access to a lawyer or being told why you're being arrested. This is going to continue. If you're arrested, you will continue to participate in mass trials of maybe up to 300, 900 people. Anyone can be arbitrarily captured, right? So that will continue. Your house will be searched without a warrant. Just thinking about what it means, I think in terms of the buildup of that security state, right? And one of the things that, Bukele said when he cast his vote, right, was that He made it clear that he expects that the newly elected Legislative Assembly will continue to expand, to extend the special powers that were granted since March 2022, right, to combat the gangs. So that's an expectation. And so that, that's what we should expect, that will continue, right? And this, this is tremendous, right? Because, despite the fact that the armed conflict in El Salvador ended 30 years ago, and there was one of the proposals, right, at that time was a reduction of the armed forces, and a reduction of the armed forces so that they wouldn't be engaged in public security. So that was one of the promises, one of the accords in 1992. And what we're seeing, and we'll be seeing now, is, really an increase of military personnel, right? Military personnel has already increased from 20,000 to 25,000. Bukele vowed, during the presidential campaign, right, that he would increase it to 40,000. So, we'll see a buildup of that military state. Maybe I'll end there to give Manuel enough time to also react to this.
Thank you, Maria. That was great and very summarized. So, Manuel, the same question to you. What are two immediate conclusions that you draw from these results?
Sure. Well, it's great to be here. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. So the first thing I would say, and I realize that this is perhaps not a very popular thing to say, but it's important to call things what they are. This is the consolidation of a very popular, non-democratic. And that may sound like a contradiction, but actually it really isn't. Democracy is not a popularity contest. Democracy is not majority rule. Democracy is a system where people vote according to clear and fair rules, where governments are elected by voters, and where governments then are subject to clear, established checks and balances. This is a minimum definition that I think we can all agree on. And this is a context in which basically every single one of those dimensions has been undermined. Checks and balances in El Salvador essentially died in May 2021. That's when Bukele and his allies packed the Supreme Court. Civil rights and protections of civil rights were essentially suspended 2 years ago when the state of exception began. And over the past year, and actually for a little longer than that, Bukele has systematically tilted the electoral playing field and systematically rewritten electoral rules to his advantage. It's very easy to forget a couple of things. It's very easy to forget that Bukele should, by constitutional rules, Bukele should not be on this ballot. That's number one. It's easy to forget that Bukele and the Nuevas Ideas majority gerrymandered the Salvadoran electoral map last year. We have barely solid models on this. The electoral reform that passed last year essentially gives Nuevas Ideas an additional 20% seats in the legislature. This is not a political system that can be defined as a democratic regime by any standard that a political scientist, at least, would find minimally acceptable. It is extremely popular. Of course it is. And it enjoys a great degree of legitimacy. This raises a bunch of questions. And I think those questions are worth thinking about. And in a moment, I'm going to make some points about that. But we need to start from that point of departure, right? If we approach this as I do, because this is my training, if we approach this as a political scientist, the sort of insights, the sort of evidence you have to draw upon to understand the regime Salvadorans are waking up in today is not from the library of studies of democracy. It's from the library of studies of competitive authoritarian regimes. And it's important to keep those two things clear. Before I move on to the next one, I'll just say that there are good reasons why we don't define democracy as simple majority rule, right? And the reason is very simple. Bukele has said it himself. You can look this up. The reason we don't define democracy as simple majority rule is that if you define democracy as simple majority rule, then there is very little stopping leaders who enjoy a majority at one point from using that majority to stay in power. Put differently, if Salvadorans woke up 5 years from now and decided they wanted to vote Bukele out because they no longer like him, I'm not sure they would be able to do that. Okay, so a second takeaway is that this is a really bad example for Latin America in two ways. Bukele's popularity and this massive re-election, which, as Maria correctly said, come on the back of this, what really amounts to the most intensive crackdown on criminal groups in Latin American history, has validated this principle that it is okay, that it is desirable to exchange liberties, to exchange freedoms, and to exchange democratic principles in order to get things done. That is a very bad lesson for Latin Americans to learn. Bad lesson in general. And with regards to security in particular, it's a particularly bad lesson to learn because folk understandings of why Bukele's crackdown has worked and not backfired have a million different blind spots. This is a very dangerous model to export or import. I'm happy to say more about that later. But this is also a very bad precedent for Latin America in a different way. And I think we have to pause and think about what actually happened last night. Last night, before any official votes were counted, I might be, or reported, I might be wrong. This may have been when about 0.6% of the vote had been counted. The entire international community rallied to congratulate a president on his reelection. This is a particularly bad precedent because it ties back to this idea of viewing democracy and legitimacy as simple majority rule. It is extremely important that we understand democracy as a process. And nothing about this election and nothing about the vote count yesterday or the vote reporting yesterday followed any kind of pre-established democratic process. That should be the standard by which democracies in Latin America and beyond recognize and validate other democracies, not based on popularity. So if you put those two things together, what this is telling you, if you are an aspiring autocrat anywhere else in Latin America, is, yeah, this can work. My people will reward me. As long as I get some things done, I can undermine democracy. And not only that, but as long as I can popular enough, the United States, the OAS, virtually every influential actor in the national community will rubber stamp my regime. So not good news. I recognize that I have sort of breezed over really important sort of questions about value judgments. But I think it's important to acknowledge those things. And they do raise very tricky questions about what we value and how we should think about democracy. And those are worth asking. But that sort of has to be the departure point. I'll stop there.
You're muted.
Yes, I just realized that. Thank you, Manuel. A lot to think there, a lot. So I'm gonna do another question. So, given yesterday's result, so what are some of the key challenges that you see in the governability and the future of democracy in El Salvador? And Maria, if you want to start, and then Manuel. And again, remember about the 8 minutes, so then we have time for the Q&A.
All right. Thank you for that question, Dr. Sin. And here I'll echo Manuel, right? I mean, I think if the question is about the future of democracy, right? I want to read something that Bukele said last night when he was announcing his victory. I mean, and this is prior, right, to sort of like the final, really formal election results, and he says, and this is celebrating in San Salvador Central Square, and in response to these claims that, he's authoritarian, that really what we're seeing is the rise of authoritarianism in El Salvador. So he says, we're not substituting democracy because El Salvador never had democracy. This is the first time in history that El Salvador has democracy. And I'm not saying it, but people say it, right? And, if democracy is about participating in elections, if democracy is just about, voting, and voting, and here just abstracting, right? I think from just even the process and how we got to that process, then surely, right? There's democracy in El Salvador, but I think that if we take, just a different approach, like Manuel was taking, of thinking of democracy as, more robust, as process, as a separation of powers, right? As the, this system of checks and balances, where the executive power doesn't fully control the legislative, the judicial branches, the supreme electoral branches, then we must ask ourselves the question, right? Is what we're seeing, a democratic process? And I would add to that actually that democracy, and I think at least as I approach it, and coming from also just histories, right, of political theory of how to think about democracy. I mean, at some point, even Bukele said this himself. He said, it's demoskratos, right? It's the rule of the people, right? But if you think about it, then democracy is, so it's not just about voting. It's also not just about the separation of these powers. It's also about citizens participating in decision making, citizens feeling like they have the freedom to assemble, to discuss, to deliberate, to oppose, to share their perspectives, right? To enjoy liberties, right? So if we have this more robust understanding, I think, of democracy, then it's troubling. Than what we're seeing and we will see in El Salvador. So if we're thinking, first, just what comes to mind in terms of just key challenges, and this one I think Manuel was already talking about, so I don't want to expand too much on it. And I think many people in the audience have already read about this probably, but it's the question of executive overreach, right? So that's really just this issue of concentrating power in the executive branch and bypassing just the traditional system of checks and balances, right? So seeing the weakening of institutions, and that's that's a major problem. But with that also comes another challenge, and that's the challenge just of civil liberties, the freedom of the press, the freedom of expression, right? So, just to do maybe a little bit of a recap of what happened during the Bukele years, so we understand what, will potentially also happen during the next 5 years, is that, you, in a robust democracy, you have, the ability of the media, of civil society, right, to act as some form of watchdog, right, to just be, hold the government accountable. and provide also diverse perspectives, right? And what we're seeing, is actually limits on that kind of accountability. We're seeing limits on this ability to act as a watchdog. So El Faro, for instance, many of you have probably read their articles, had to move to Costa Rica. And this was because, they felt that the government was harassing and could potentially close their offices, right? Just to give you a very stark example, in July of last year, there's this really amazing international fair of books that is held in Guatemala. And the government, tried to stop the presentation of a work by this author, Michel Recinos. And it was a collection of short stories. And they had, a particular problem with one short story in that book. And the short story was called Barberos en Huelga, which in English is Barbers on Strike. And it was, a story basically about a group of young men, street vendors, barbers, who were being disappeared by the government. And they were being arrested and held without, just any proof, and being accused of being gang members, right? So that was the story. That was what the story about. So imagine the government trying to stop just, the presentation of this short story in an international festival held in Guatemala, right? So that's, the extent of the censorship and the extent of just how, just this freedom of expression, right, is being curtailed. We know that at least 50 government officials and high-profile critics have had to leave El Salvador. One of them is Berta de Leon, who used to be his former attorney. She had to leave El Salvador. I think she's in Mexico now. There's also, if we're just thinking about your ability to protest, right? So 5 very prominent environmental defenders who were the ones who played a crucial role in securing this historic ban on mining in El Salvador. So they were arrested, right? And under, just under various charges, right? So the opposition, right? It extends to, this is not just the parties, right? This is not just government officials. This is also citizens. This is also environmental defenders and activists, who are being stopped from just, participating, right? Democratically participating in society, deliberating, sharing their perspectives, right? Acting in decision making. And I think, just add one more thing about this, and Manuel was mentioning gerrymandering, right? And I think that's pretty crucial, right? So there's a reduction of municipalities that happened. I believe the numbers went from 244 to, and maybe correct me, Manuel, to 44 maybe, or 40, right? And the justification behind that was that would reduce the tax burden on the state. Now, 262 municipalities. Okay, so yes, thank you for correcting me, right? But it's a drastic reduction of municipalities. And I was in Chalatenango, just in December, and I was talking to people there, right? And one of the concerns, right, is that actually these municipalities, and especially the local councils, right, that were under these municipalities, were important sites of decision making for people. These were sites where memory projects were being promoted, right? So there's a concern that now there won't be even, now that everything is so centralized, that you won't have the opportunity to participate at that local level, right? So that was one of the concerns that people in this small town of La Vuelta in Chalatenango were sharing, and these used to be, still are FMLN strongholds, right? But there was, it's really a tactic to get people to participate less at the local level. That's at least how I understand it, and how people were telling me they were experiencing it. And I'll end there, and maybe just add one more thing, and this will become, it will become a problem, right, in El Salvador, a key challenge. And a key challenge is just the question of economic and social inequality, right? We're seeing just, the economic situation in El Salvador has really worsened, just in terms of, if you're thinking about the price of staple foods, it has skyrocketed, right? Like 30% in rural areas, about 20% in urban areas. You have a country that is importing most of its food. It's not exporting, right? So just the rural, populace has really been left behind. And so that's going to be a key challenge. And if we think also about democracy in more robust terms, right, as also questions of, a certain kind of economic equality, right, and social equality, then, then we're seeing that as also a key challenge.
Gracias. Gracias, María. And thank you. Thinking on those on both languages. Thank you, Maria, and thanks for pointing out all these challenges and problems. And before we go to Manuel, I just want to remind you to add your questions in the Q&A or in the chat. And Manuel, now the floor is yours.
Sure. Let me just say one thing broadly about sort of governance, and then actually tie that into one of the questions. So if we take a step back, governance is sort of many things, but two things that you need to execute good governance is, number one, you sort of need coordination capacity. Right? You need to be able to get things done, and if you can't get things done, you end up basically in where Peru is right now, or sort of where Honduras is right now, right? Total inability to coordinate around state projects. Bukele clearly won't have that problem because he doesn't need to coordinate with anyone. So in that sense, actually, this is from that perspective, this is actually, on that dimension, a boost for governability. We also need accountability, as Maria said. And we know from sort of dozens of examples everywhere of governments who have a high capacity to act with very low accountability, is that you usually end up seeing the same things, right? You end up seeing very inefficient policy. You end up seeing pretty widespread corruption. And occasionally you end up seeing some real tragedies. This is kind of what we know from the past. And I think this is the thing to look out for in El Salvador. This is a president who's going to have a huge ability to do whatever he wants, but who is not going to be subject to checks and balances. And one reason why we like checks and balances is because they usually stop really bad things from happening. Checks and balances are your friend who stops you before you leave the bar and says, are you sure this is a good idea? Give me your keys. Okay, what actually comes next? I don't know, but I think there's sort of two questions that can help us understand. The first is who the new enemy will be. And so this is a president who has followed a pretty clear strategy from sort of the beginning. This is a president whose narrative requires an enemy. This is a president who fights wars. It began as a war against the political establishment, against los mismos de siempre. Then, actually, and we tend to forget about this, it became a war against COVID. Then it became a war against the gangs. And what's interesting right now is that he has basically defeated these three enemies. He has won his three wars. And yes, it's possible to continue spinning a narrative around these enemies, but my sense is that eventually they stop paying off. So one question is, who does he turn to now? Some of the things he said suggest that the crosshairs are probably going to be on the free press, on civil society, on universities. Needless to say, that would be a very bad outcome. But this is kind of, I think, the first key question to answer. I don't know the answer, but it's an important one. And the second, as Maria said, is what is he going to do about the economy? And so this is sort of the question Bukele has been able to avoid during his first term. That's kind of the biggest rabbit thing to pull out of the hat. Maria talked about this from sort of a more social lens in terms of inequalities, absolutely critical. From a macroeconomic perspective, El Salvador has the highest debt burden in Central America. It has been described by basically every international technical observer as being on an unsustainable path. Bukele has sort of already been forced into pension reform. He's been pushed toward experimenting with Bitcoin. He's been forced to negotiate with the IMF. This is all sort of ongoing. My sense is that what crime was to his first presidency, the economy is going to be to his second. And so keeping an eye on how he begins to deal with that, and in particular, how those negotiations with the IMF go, I think is going to tell us a lot. So I'll stop there because I think we have some great questions. So I want to make sure we have enough time.
I'll read the first question in the chat. And Manuel, you kind of touched on that just now, but maybe if you can add, and because we have several questions, if you could limit your answers to around a minute maybe, and so that we can try to cover a few in the remaining time until the hour. So the question is on what's next. And Manuel, you just said that you expect the economy to be the big issue rather than security in the second term. But the author of the question says that Bukele has had no socio-economic policy. Hunger and starvation are soaring. His focus has been solely on security and big projects like the library, stadium, and Miss Universe. Do you expect any change? So maybe Maria, if you have any reactions to that question.
I think, what Manuel was saying, that, just El Salvador right now, in addition to that debt and just going back to the soaring food prices, right, it's on the, it's really on the edge of a basic food shortage crisis, right? You're having cases of malnutrition in the country. I mean, you already had them before, right? But just that, that has increased. And, it's not a coincidence then, that we see this buildup of the security state. Because I think Bukele knows that, this popularity that he has attained, right, by fighting the gangs, by, ensuring that, the situation in El Salvador has changed, right? It's undeniable, right? I mean, for those of you, who are in El Salvador, who have visited in El Salvador, most people will tell you, that there's a tremendous difference, right? Now you can enter neighborhoods that you couldn't enter before. People are playing on the streets, staying up at night, right? You feel the sense of security. So it's not a surprise. I mean, that popularity is not a surprise. It's coming from somewhere. There's something tangible and concrete that has changed in the reality of Salvadorans, right? And I don't want to, underestimate that, right? Because, of course, if you put yourself in those shoes, in the shoes of someone who used to be extorted, whose family member was killed by a gang member, et cetera, and you're seeing a change in that reality, it's understandable, right, that you would support this precedent. But, I think that's, with this food crisis, with debt, I think, that's going to start changing, right? And then, but now you have this, massive military, that is supposed to, go up to 40,000 people, right? Who will, then now repress, if anyone goes to protest, right? So I think that, that I think that the economic will become an issue. And then it's no coincidence, right, that this buildup of the military will sort of like enable, a shutting down of that dissent. So that is a scary situation.
Thank you. Thank you, Maria. So I'm going to read a question by Vicente Dubon. And he says, referring to history, how can we find patterns in the military regimes of the 20th century? Are we going back to pro-patria times? Most important, what is the outcome for Salvadoran people? Those regimes ended in political violence, violation of human rights. However, at the same time, the El Salvador of today is not the same society of the 20th century Cold War. Any of you, whoever wants to?
Yeah, look, I don't have those are brilliant questions. I don't have a great answer, but Maria just went, so I feel like I need to step up. So first, Vicente, I will get to you, But let me just say one thing about social policy. I just really want to emphasize because it's so important. Maria is completely right. And the way I would think about this is that security policy has been de facto social policy and de facto economic policy. Because this issue of the gangs was so clearly intertwined with people's social condition and with people's economic condition that by attacking it, Bukele has boosted people's social condition and economic condition. It's funny, if you look at official data, incomes in El Salvador have gone down. If you ask a lot of people, they'll tell you their incomes have gone up, and that's because a lot of them are not paying extortion payments anymore. Right? So remains to be seen on social policy. I agree with Maria that at some point this is going to exhaust itself, and Bukele will have to actually start dealing with these issues directly. Worth pointing out that this is still directly related to the economy. Right? Bukele has been cutting social spending in part because he desperately needs to relieve the debt burden. And so this is why I go back to the economy first. Unless he can take care of the debt burden, he's not going to be able to do much in terms of social policy. Okay, Vicente, great question. I don't have a great answer for the sort of historical parallels. I would defer to Mr. Héctor Lindo Fuentes, who is probably the best person in the world to ask this question to. And he will tell you that he sees a lot of parallels in sort of the OG military regimes. He's fond of drawing some parallels between this moment and Maximiliano Hernández Martínez. One clear parallel that I see is that very different contexts, of course, but there is a security rationale for the interruption of regular political processes. Right? You have to remember, again, very different context, but for those regimes, sort of a huge part of the original impetus was security against communist peasants and security against violence in the countryside. There are some echoes. If you sort of listen to what Bukele said last night, this entire project is predicated upon security from the past of gangs. So we do know, again, I can tell you what the evidence shows. We do know, and I have Javier Corrales, a brilliant political scientist, to thank for this observation, that virtually every president who has won re-election in Latin America by a big margin has then overseen periods of inflation, massive corruption, autocratization, and or backsliding. I believe the one exception, if you look at sort of the top 10, is in the DR. So we could probably talk at some length trying to unpack why this is the case, why we see this pattern. But what I would leave you with for now is that history does not bode well in this situation. And you can very easily imagine a scenario in which 3-4 years from now, Bukele's popularity is not what it is, and this regime takes a much more sort of visibly authoritarian and repressive direction. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. I'm going to collapse a few questions. There were 2 questions on the role of the diaspora and voter turnout outside of El Salvador and in the United States in particular. And I'm in Maryland. And so right around the University of Maryland, there were lines that hundreds and hundreds of voters for most of yesterday with high levels of enthusiasm and also high levels of organization, given the weight that all these people, these voters, majority of which apparently, at least anecdotally, declared that they were voting for Bukele. So there's a lot of interest in the role of voter turnout and the role of the diaspora in sustaining his government. And then another question by Juan Diego Alvarado, one of LACS and JVPT, government and politics at the University of Maryland students, is on the role of the party and the role of his party in the next administration. So if I could get reactions from both of you on both the role of the diaspora and the role of the party. And we can start maybe with Maria and then go to Manuel.
Okay, I'll take up the role of the diaspora, and I think Manuel can take take the role of the party, given that that's specifically also what he studies and has written on. So I think what I would say about the diaspora, maybe maybe I'll give you an example. I was in El Salvador in December, and I took an Uber. And there was, the man who was driving was this man who had left El Salvador when he was a child, and he had moved to Venezuela, and then he moved to Spain, and he had returned to El Salvador. And he was just, he had come back because he was, just enamored by this image that Bukele was projecting of the country, right, as this sort of Bitcoin paradise, just this country that is modernizing, a country that is just, becoming, just very different, right, from, the propaganda machine of Bukele is something really to study. It's quite fascinating and just, otherworldly, just how Bukele's government, and he has a background as a publicist, right? And so it's no surprise that his government has been able to really just project this different image of El Salvador, right? So if El Salvador was known, in 2015 for being the most violent country of the world, if we're thinking about homicide rates, right? We're miles away from that image now, in the sense that, right, we have a very different image of El Salvador. Because of just this propaganda machine. It's no surprise, the president also speaks English, and has made it a point to just, internationalize his discourse, and to really project himself outside in ways that other, presidents didn't, right? So I think that first of all, just that I think tremendous support that he has from the diaspora has to do with a heavy investment in reaching out to this diaspora, and that on the part of the government. And then, you also, I think, you have people who fled El Salvador, because of security, right? Because of the insecurity in El Salvador. And having a president that is dealing with that situation, right? So I've heard people who fled El Salvador and voted for him. And the reason why they're voting for him is really because, he's someone who did something about the gangs, right? The very gangs that displaced them from their homes, right? So I think I see these, these two things that we're thinking about the diaspora is just that the turnout of the diaspora in these elections is unprecedented. So that's something, to really follow. And I think that it, partly it has to do just with, the success of Bukele and his government in really, changing the image of El Salvador and actually encouraging, a certain kind of patriotism, a certain kind of love for El Salvador. That's very interesting and something to to think about. With these inspiring messages, right, etc. So I'll stop there and let Manuel take up the question about the party.
Juan Diego, thank you. I am eternally grateful to anyone who gives me an opportunity to talk about parties. Look, I think the key question here is what kind of party will Bukele build? Right now, Nuevas Ideas is a fairly thin party. It's a pretty hollow party. It mostly serves as an electoral vehicle, as a personalistic electoral vehicle to allow Bukele to run for office, and then to allow Bukele to basically handpick legislative candidates. The question is whether he decides to invest in real party building, whether he decides to invest in a hegemonic party, basically in the style of a party like the Poli, which is a big comparison to make. I understand that. Very, very different contexts. But the key difference is that the Poli was a party with a very rich inner life, in which different constituencies, in which different interests, in which different currents participated, a party in which they became invested And that was basically the secret to the PRI's success for them. And I know I'm simplifying things here. So Nueva Ciudad is going to become one of two things. It's going to remain basically a personalistic vehicle for Bukele, or it's going to become the central organizing principle of Salvadoran politics. And political life will happen inside of Nuevas Ideas. That has major implications. What Bukele will choose to do, I don't know. My sense is that he has very few incentives to invest in sort of some real hegemonic party building. Doing that requires giving up some power, giving up some control. It requires investing resources. And the payoffs really have to do with two things. They have to do with sort of keeping opposition out, and they have to do with ensuring kind of the long-term survival of the regime. I don't think Bukele feels that he's going to need any help doing those things anytime soon. And so I think he has pretty limited incentives to make Nuevas Ideas a sort of real party with an internal life. My expectation would be that at least for the foreseeable period, it essentially remains a personalistic rubber stamp party. That would be my guess.
Thank you, Manuel. And the next question, it's about historical memory, and you mentioned that issue. So the question is, do the speakers have any reflections on the degree to which Bukele may implement policies of national forgetting about the Civil War, the peace accords, and grassroots commemoration and documentation processes? We have already seen the recent destruction of the Reconciliation Monument in San Salvador. What is next? And Maria, Maria, go ahead.
Yeah, it's really concerning, right? Because, you know, when Bukele got elected, there was the case of El Mozote that had opened up and it was moving, you know, and there was a sense that there would be justice in that case, right? This was a massacre that happened in 1981, and it was carried out by the Atacatl Battalion, which was, you know, trained, funded by the United States. And there was a sense that there was progress in this. And then, you know, when his government, when you know, the Legislative Assembly just sacked these judges from the Supreme Court, from the Constitutional Chamber, you know, that really stopped that process. And I think that, you know, it's just is one example, right, of just how all of these projects of national memory that had been, you know, especially I think promoted during the FMLN years, have really taken a step back. I mean, Bukele himself, you know, he said in El Mozote that, you know, this whole thing of the Civil War had been a farce. And, you know, still people are deconstructing what he meant, but at least, you know, people in Chalatenango, when I was talking to them, they understood that, you know, that just meant it was, you know, was signaling to people in El Salvador that the country was embracing a policy of national forgetting, right? That we have to move on. And, you know, when I was there actually, you know, in December, someone from the Nuevas Ideas party, you know, actually said, because we were holding these workshops, these embroidery workshops, you know, that were both trying to reconstruct the memory of the Civil War, and it's part of the project that you mentioned at the beginning that I'm involved in El Salvador. So this Nueva Ideas, you know, party member, she said, you know, it's time to forget. You know, this happened already, right? It's time to move on. We have to forget. So I think that, you know, that's just expressive, I think, of a sentiment. Of a sentiment of the Nuevas Ideas party, that this is, you know, something that passed. We need to move on. And that's why the focus, right, on projecting this image of El Salvador as a space of modernity, or a space, right, of Bitcoin paradise. And it is troubling. So I don't know, you know, exactly what kinds of policies will be enacted. But I think I foresee, just difficulties in terms of funding, of getting funding to promote some of these projects is what I'm seeing.
Maybe we can close with a couple of questions. We have great questions in the chat and the Q&A, but unfortunately we don't have time for all of them. But there were a few questions on the opposition asking if you could say a little bit more on your thoughts on what potential there is there, and maybe expanding beyond the opposition that you have mentioned. And then there was another question that I thought was very interesting by Carolina Sampo, so researcher of CLACS, that wanted to know why this tough on crime, mano dura model that is not new and had been implemented before in El Salvador and then also in other countries. Why did it seem to work now? And so I know these are huge questions and we only have 3 minutes left, but if you want each to give 1.5 minutes of your reactions to either, that would be wonderful. Thank you.
Okay, let me try to give the 90-second version of some of the things that have said Bukele's security approach apart. Very, very broadly, the reason crackdowns tend to fail is that they elicit violent reactions from criminal groups, and they push criminal groups to strengthen, to become more organized, to become more violent. Bukele managed to sort of interrupt the sequence, and I'm not sure I can summarize this part in 60 seconds, but it has a lot to do with what came before the crackdown, which is this process of negotiation through a number of mechanisms, which I would be happy to explain in writing. What the negotiations did was that they essentially undermined the gang's ability of sort of rapid response. At the same time, Bukele was investing heavily in developing the military's, essentially, to misappropriate a term, strike capacity. And so when he finally decides to sort of flip the switch and go on the offensive, that's a double whammy. He hits them extremely hard. The gangs have deteriorated in their ability to respond. He's able to essentially deactivate this kind of reactive sequence that follows crackdowns. And that's really, in a nutshell, why it worked. And so if you did want to emulate this model abroad and anywhere else, what you have to do is you have to find a way to stop that reactive sequence. In El Salvador, that meant negotiating in a very specific way. There may be other ways to do that. I'm not sure we really know of any. That's it.
I would just, I would just add that basically the big difference, right? I think it has to do just with the fact that, Bukele has been granted special powers in ways that other presidents weren't, right? I mean, just the state of emergency and just the complete suspension of civil liberties, something like that, akin to that, did not exist before. And I think it's just because if you have power over the legislative assembly, over the Supreme Court, and you can pass, whatever laws you tell your, the Supreme Court to pass, and the legislative assembly to support, then they're going to pass. And I think that's just the big difference, right? That you have a context where there's really no checks and balances, and so then you really can, full on support all the kinds of policies that that other governments supported in the past, but had some kind of limits on, right? The kind of security state that they could build. So Dr. Jose Miguel Cruz calls this mano dura, or iron fist policies on steroids, right? Because just the extent, right, of these policies. The policies themselves are not unprecedented, right? But it's just the extent of it, right? The special powers that have been granted to really stop anyone on the streets for, not just a few months, right? This is since it's been 22 months, more than 22 months since these special powers have been granted to just, suspend civil liberties and incarcerate whoever you deem to be a gang member. Giving these power to the police and to the military, is certainly, something I think not necessarily new, right? The police and the military sometimes did that in the past, like what Sanchez said with the extraordinary measures. But I think just the extent and the permanent nature of it is what's radically different.
Thank you, Maria, and thank you, Manuel. And we are at 3:02, so we are right on time to finish with the panel. This was a magnificent, great panel, a lot of information and a lot to think about. And thanks so much. Thanks to the audience for being here. And we will have some other talks, especially with elections coming. Thank you very much, and hope to see you all next time.
Muchas gracias.